Well, good evening. So tonight we're joining Bible study already in progress, and we're going to get ready to have some conversation following a small group time, talking about some of the gender issues of text. But before we do that, I thought I would catch you up a little bit on what we've already discussed. We've been talking about different ways in which this text can be read, and we talked about some folks reading this text literally, and we talked about how some of the issues that the text of Genesis, some of the problems that poses in the text in Genesis, including things like Cain finding a wife that in chapter 4, and also Cain's fear of other people who are in the wilderness, when the text has only given us really three alive people after the murder of Abel. We've also talked about how this text sometimes can be read as a spiritual allegory, but also knowing that the original authors of the text would not know of something like the snake being a symbol for the devil. That would have been before the development of that idea. Although we do recognize that clearly, if you look at sin as separation, like somebody like Paul Tillich, that clearly there is separation in the system here, in that there's the relationship between the man and the woman. There's separation there. There's separation between the people, growing separation between the people and their God. Also, there's even a break in the relationship between the people and their relationship with the created order, and we see that held up in the enmity between the woman and the snake that God discusses. We've also talked about looking at this text ideologically as a story of beginnings. Things like, why is childbirth painful? And we have an explanation for that. Why do humans and snakes not live well together, especially in like the book of Numbers? And we have an explanation for that. Why snakes crawl on their belly? We have an explanation for that. And so this being a story of the seeds of reality, the reality that the people observed, and origin stories for how those things came to be into the world. So what we're going to do now, right now, everybody in their small groups is discussing to what extent the historicity of Adam and Eve, how important, to what extent that's important to their individual faith. And so that's what people are discussing now. We're not going to eavesdrop on those conversations without them knowing. But that's the question they're discussing. How important is it for their faith, for Adam and Eve to be historical people? When we get back now, as I'm going to call everybody together, one of the things we're going to discuss first off is gender issues. So we're glad that you're here, joining us midstream, and I hope this has been a suitable update in a nutshell anyway. Well, thank you, everybody. I want to regather us so we can cover some more of the questions for this evening. It's a live topic. I trust you were having some good discussions at your table. It seemed like you were having good discussions at your table. So our fourth question here tonight is, for the disobedient act, eating the fruit, why does God have the man rule over the woman? Talking about the gender issues in this story. I think gender is a very interesting topic in the two creation narratives. Even how gender emerges in the two stories. It emerges in different ways, right? We've discussed this. In the first creation story, it emerges as part of, there are male and female, and God created them as part of humankind. And in the second story, there is a man, a person, and then there is a woman created out of the man, so that then that's the first differentiation of gender. Before that, there would just be a man. And so it's interesting how gender emerges in the two stories. It's typical in Genesis, and I think this is going to be interesting to look at. This is going to be throughout the book. It's typical in Genesis for women to serve as wives and mothers. That tends to be the role given to women in Genesis. And we'll see that throughout. Usually most of the women, that's not the case in the entire Bible. It's not even the case in the entire New Testament. But we'll see that mostly in the book of Genesis, that women are usually connected to a patriarch, to a husband, and then are rejoiced because they're able to give birth to children who carry on the story of the patriarchs. We'll see that. I think one of the things that's important for us to remember, and is sometimes a challenge to remember when you're reading the text and are frustrated by the conversation about gender, is that it's important to remember that Genesis is not a 21st century text. Right? It's almost 3,000 years old. So it's an old text. And that's important to remember. And as an old text, it represents the world from which it emerged. Right? So the authors didn't know our world, but they knew their world. And so a lot of representation of women and gender in the Bible is a reflection of the world from which it came. So, that means at times the authors are holding pretty firm to the status quo of that era. At times they're challenging it. It would not look always to us like they're challenging that, because we would say that is not a very modern view of gender and equality, but for the original authors and for that original culture, there are times when I think they're probably pretty convinced that they're pushing the envelope on gender. We're not always going to see that. And I think it's okay to say that. And I think it's okay to then say, well, then I disagree with this representation of gender. It's okay. You can argue with the text. Look, there are multiple traditions and sources put together that don't always agree. The folks who wrote the Bible were comfortable with there being argument in the text. So you certainly can look at something and be like, I don't know about this. I don't really like this part. That's okay. I mean, at some point we're going to get to Judges. If you're not uncomfortable with most of that text, that might be, I mean, there's some pretty terrible stuff in Judges. And we will see that. And as you read it, you'll think, yeah, this is pretty terrible. I don't know why this is in the Bible. So people getting cut in pieces. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, right? So you can start that process of looking at the text and having disagreements and dialogues and, coming to a place where you realize, right, that you can argue with it and accept that it's divine scripture, inspired, but at the same time, wrestle with it and struggle with it. I mean, Jesus interpreted things in the scripture probably different than some of the other rabbis of his day, and that's one of the things that got him in trouble. They were not in agreement. I thought Jesus wasn't being very faithful to that text. We would say he was. We're Christian. But it's okay. It's okay to wrestle. It's okay to wrestle with that text. In the second creation story, the one which we're continuing today in chapters 3 and 4, there does seem to be a shift in the partnership. So when God takes the woman from the man in the second creation story, the idea is that she is his partner. One, they're going to partner together to create new life. One of the ways that they're sharing in the creative work of God. They're going to partner to bring life out of the earth. Right? So they're tending the garden together. They're partners. And then everything happens with the snake and the fruit. And then we get this piece where all of a sudden the relationship shifts, and it is the man will dominate the woman will long for the man. And later on, continuing that theme, Adam names Eve, which is a way in which, so essentially, I'm giving you a name. Which is kind of similar in some ways to what happened with Adam and the animals, right? So we had the whimsical poem last week, but the same basic idea. God says to the man, name the animals. And later on, after this fall, God says, the man names the woman. So the relationship certainly does shift, and we can recognize it certainly shifts. So the question then is this the origin of some kind of hierarchy within the genders, or is this an origin story looking at the society from which this text was written and saying, how did we get here? Well, after the relationship started breaking down in the garden, we got to where we are now. So one of the questions would be, does the author see this as a negative thing, or a positive thing, or neutral? I think you could argue that the author sees it as a negative thing, that this is one of the results of separation, and now this is how relationships end up being structured. This is what we see in our world. So how is this interpreted is one of the things that makes this text really challenging. So it's been interpreted, you may have experienced this, as an interpretation of women being subordinate to men, less valuable. Right? Is this a surprise to anybody? Has no one heard that some people look at this text this way? So this is familiar, right? And using as the proof is that, well, the woman was created second. So that we are looking only at the second creation story. Well, that's proof of something, right? That, well, if women were second, they must not be quite as good as men. So that's one of the proofs. Now, there are challenges within the text, like Cain and Abel. Abel was born second, but we have these stories of the young, all throughout Genesis, as the second born being the one God chooses. That happens all over. We also see as part of that as well, the woman in this text was a seductress, and that's what happened here. Now, if you read the text, that is not in it. But that's been read into it, which says a lot more probably about us than it does about the text, right? And also the other proof for the women being subordinate to men is that, God's saying the man will be the head, which isn't necessarily God's command, but it's sometimes interpreted that way, right? This idea, so if we address these, the idea of the woman being created second is only in one of the two stories. So that's one way we can look at this. That they were created to be partners and companions. She was not created by God to be a servant to the man. For tending, for procreation, for bringing forth new life. That's one of the ways that the text doesn't really say how it's always been interpreted. The idea that, well, the woman ate the fruit. So, she's the one that messed it up, not the man. Well, the text, if you look, now, the woman does taste the fruit first, that's true. But the text is pretty clear on this, that the man and the woman were together. So if you read through that text, the man is standing right beside her. She doesn't say, like, let me go get the man. He's over working the garden. Like, they're together. It's just that the woman is the one who's actually having the conversation. The man is present, but seems to be complicit or passive in the encounter. But he's still there. There's still responsibility. I don't think the text was thinking, well, it's just the woman's fault. The text, I think, pretty clearly shows the two together. And I think that's kind of the point, right? It's the two together start to have these breaks from their relationship with God. Not that one does and one doesn't. This idea of seductress, well, it's not mentioned or even suggested in the text. Again, I think it's more telling of the readers of the text in how we look at gender and how we look at the relationship between men and women, how men have long thought of women, that we read that into the text that, well, if Adam ate the apple, clearly it's because Eve used her seductive powers to convince him. But it's not in the text. It's not in the text. And we should be very aware that it's not in the text. And if you didn't notice that's not in the text, read it again, and you will see it is totally lacking from anything resembling being seductive. In fact, some scholars will suggest that the reason that it is the woman who gives the fruit to the man is that represents the traditional role in that society of how things were, that women fed men. And so that would be why it might be set up in this ancient text that way, and that ancient readers would have noticed that of the woman would prepare food and be the person who provided. And so they would look at it that way, not as a seductress thing. They would look at it as upholding, at that time, the traditional roles of men and women in that relationship. Not as a negative, just as a reality. And so finally, we have the placed under male authority, so we can look at that. That's one of the reasons that sometimes folks. So this happens after the encounter. This is part of the punishment. And so, you all know men, so you can see how that would be a punishment. So rather than thinking of this as God's vote of confidence for the men, it could be that it's more like, well, we're sorry, woman, you've really missed out, and now this man's going to be in charge. So it might not be quite as biased against women as we might have thought. So here's the reality. I think it's not quite as biased. It's certainly not as biased as we've heard. The text isn't. So some suggest that the male dominance then becomes a product of the fall. That it's maybe a punishment for everybody. The loss of the equality that was built into creation. Maybe it's a punishment for men and women. That this society turned out the way it did. But we're also going to see there are going to be plenty of strong women in Genesis, and there's going to be plenty of strong women in the Old Testament throughout. That said, we also still have to remember that it is a product of a society in which women very rarely held formal positions of power. That's reflected in this text, and that's one of the realities that we have to struggle with as we read a text like Genesis. It is reflecting the reality of its time. Cain and Abel. So a lot of the story here today that we read, chapter 4 especially, is about Cain and Abel, two brothers. So the man and the woman procreate, they have Cain and they have Abel. So I want to just talk just a little bit about some of the interesting dynamics of this story. One of the dynamics, and it's going to continue to show up all through Genesis, is the struggle between the youngest and the oldest siblings. And I will say, unfortunately, for those of us who are oldest children, and myself, Genesis very much subverts that hierarchy. So there's kind of an expectation in traditional society that the oldest is the son, and the privileged son, the inheritor, the one who becomes head of the family. That's assumed in ancient culture, sometimes still today in modern culture. In Genesis, it never works out, and we see it with Cain and Abel. God prefers Abel's offering, right? God to the two and prefers Abel. That's the problem. It's going to happen with Jacob and Esau, and we know the story of the trickery. Ishmael and Isaac is another example of God showing favor to the youngest. The Joseph story is a great example of this. There's always jealousy, there's always strife within the family because of this, but it is very consistent throughout Genesis that the younger sibling is showed God's favor and the older sibling is not. And it starts all the way back here in the Cain and Abel story. There are also many who think of this story, look at this story of Cain and Abel, representing the conflict and also the symbiosis of shepherd and farmer in the ancient world. Right, so there's this battle that they do two different things. So Cain is farming, Abel is shepherding, and there's this struggle between which offering does God prefer and who wins. But at the same time, they're relying on each other because it's hard to do one without the other. And so some folks will look at this as a tale of that long ancient struggle between shepherd and farmer. And finally, one of the things I think is interesting about this story is that Cain continues the sin of his parents. The man and the woman, what they do wrong is they try to be like God. Right? That's the temptation. You could be like God. which is the same kind of sin that Cain continues, with taking a life. So we see in the creation story that it's God who is the giver of life, and that life is in God's realm. And here is Cain deciding to end life without God's input, continuing that to be like God. And we're going to see, as we're going to see elsewhere, especially in our readings next week, that in some way, with the entrance of sin and these broken relationships into creation, that we are going to start to see creation unraveling. That God brought life and created life, and then the creatures of God are undoing life. We'll start to unravel creation. And then we're going to see it in the Noah story, which is the ultimate unraveling of creation. Everything that God has created, including holding chaos, is all let go and destroyed. With just a little hope that we could start to enter life again. And so it becomes this story of life in creation. I mean, the humans were created to help God bring life into the world, for procreation, for bringing crops forth, and yet their first child, human reproduction, brings death in and starts to undo creation. So that's going to be a theme that we're going to see through Genesis, and it starts in this Cain and Abel story. The last thing I want to say before we do a little bit more small group time is one of the lenses through which I read this story that is helpful for me is looking at this story as a story of growing up and a loss of innocence. So I'm going to suggest this as one of the ways you can read the Adam and Eve story, a way that makes sense to me. That it's a story about growing up. So in the process of growing up, we begin little by little to lose the innocence of youth. We become more aware of what's right and wrong, of what's good and evil. And even though we have that knowledge, we make bad decisions. Even knowing things that are wrong, we continue to do them. We become more aware of our bodies, which is one of the things we see in the Adam and Eve story. That first they start to realize what's good and evil, then they start to make decisions about whether they want to do right or wrong, whether they want to obey or not. And then after that, they start to be aware of their bodies. And they start to become ashamed of that. Then they head out into the real world, and they realize that life is hard and life is dangerous. I think it's our experience, right? We grow up and things become more and more complicated. Our relationships with the world become more complicated. Our relationship with the created order becomes more complicated. We do things to try to tame it and destroy, and our relationships with other people become more complicated. We see this immediately with Adam and Eve. They're living together in this perfect harmony, and all of a sudden, he said, well, the woman you gave me this. And so she starts to, this snake is really who's to blame. We start to see these fractures in the relationships as the relationships become more and more complicated. The relationship with God becomes more complicated. It's almost like this childlike trust of God and this relationship with God, and then all of a sudden, they're saying, we don't want you to see us naked. So we're hiding. The relationship starts to complicate. We see this relationship, the relationship we have with our bodies becomes more complicated. As we grow up and we become more aware and we decide there's things about it we don't like. I know we have little kids. They don't ever think like, oh, I wish my ears weren't so big. I wish my face didn't look like this. But we start to get that way, right, as we get older. And even with ourself, the relationship becomes more complicated. We start to question if we really like who we are. And so in that sense, I think this story becomes not just a story about like a man named Adam, whose name, as we noticed, really is man or human being, in the story of a woman named Eve. And it's not even a story about blame, like who's to blame for the fall of humanity? Is it Adam or Eve? But it becomes a human story to which we can all relate. Because in some way we've all had that story. We've all left the comfortable place and went out into the world and things were complicated, and we've had relationships where there's brokenness, and we've had times where we feel like we can't be in this kind of trusting, loving relationship with God because it's just too hard. And we have these experiences where we don't know if we like ourselves or our bodies, and we're ashamed and embarrassed about things about ourselves. We've had things where we've been let down, and that's certainly part of this story, right? The perfect plan of how this is all going to go starts to shatter immediately. And so I think it's this human story, a human story that in some way we can relate to. In some way we've all grown up and left Eden, just like we heard in the Emily Dickinson poem. You leave a place, but you can never really go back. We've all had that experience. And so, for our final discussion, what I would like you to talk about at your tables is, where do you see yourself in today's readings? Where do you see yourself? So, we're now going to sign off. And for next week, for those of you who'd like to join us again online, I encourage you to read chapters 6 through 9. And I thank you very much for joining us.